The United States once offered Denmark $100 million in gold for Greenland. That was in 1946, and the offer was kept secret. Denmark said no. It wasn't the first time America had tried to take the island, and it wouldn't be the last. This is the story of why the largest island on Earth has been wanted again and again for more than a century and a half, and why the answer was never America's to give. It's July 7th, 2026, at the NATO summit in Ankara. President Donald Trump is meeting Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and he's talking about Greenland. He says the island should be controlled by the United States, not by Denmark. It's surrounded by China ships and Russian ships. He's been saying versions of this for a year and a half. This time, he's saying it at NATO's own summit. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen answers the same day. It is a well-known position of the United States that it wants to own and take over Greenland, she says. I hope that it is equally well known everywhere that this is not going to happen. She says Denmark is ready to defend every inch of NATO, including its own territory. Iceland's Prime Minister Kristrún Frostadóttir adds that Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland. Then the summit moves on, and the declaration the leaders signed doesn't mention Greenland at all. And on the second day, Trump praises the Allies' defense spending and doesn't bring the island up again. Greenland is the largest island on Earth, and about 57,000 people live there. It governs itself, but it belongs to the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark handles its defense and its foreign policy. The United States keeps one military base there on the northwest coast, 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The base is called P2FIC Space Base, and no American base sits farther north. It runs the Pentagon's northernmost deep-water port. Mostly, though, it exists for a radar. The upgraded early warning radar at P2FIC watches for ballistic missiles coming over the top of the world. That location isn't replaceable. The shortest path for a Russian missile aimed at North America runs over the pole, and P2FIC's radar faces straight up that approach. No radar on the American mainland can see what it sees. Greenland also anchors one end of a naval choke point, the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and Britain that Russian ships and submarines have to cross to reach the Atlantic. The right to be there was written into the 1951 defense agreement with Denmark. That's the first reason America wants the island. The second reason is what's in the ground. Greenland holds deposits of 43 of the 50 minerals the U.S. government lists as critical, rare earths among them. Almost none of it has ever been dug. The island has exactly 2 working mines, and neither one produces rare earths. The third is the ice, or what's left of it. The Arctic Ocean is opening to ships. Nearly 1,800 ships used its polar waterways last year. That's close to 40% more than a decade earlier. Both of the Arctic shipping routes on the Atlantic side of the pole pass Greenland's waters. America isn't built for that ocean yet. The Coast Guard has 3 polar icebreakers, and the oldest was commissioned in 1976. Russia has more than 40, and 8 of them are nuclear-powered. The United States has started building new ones, but the first heavy icebreaker isn't due until after 2030. In December 2025, Trump named Louisiana's governor, Jeff Landry, his special envoy to Greenland. Landry accepted with a post. It would be an honor, he wrote, to make Greenland a part of the U.S. Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen called the statements completely unacceptable and summoned the American ambassador. In early January, the White House confirmed the president had discussed a range of options on Greenland, including military ones. Frederiksen answered on Danish television, "If the United States attacks another NATO country, then everything stops." On January 17th, Trump posted an ultimatum, 10% tariffs on Denmark and 7 other allies, rising to 25% by June. The tariffs would stay, he wrote, until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. European soldiers had landed in Greenland that same week. France sent about 15 to the capital, Nuuk, and Germany, and 5 other allies sent small teams of their own. On the day of the tariff post, thousands marched in Copenhagen under the slogan, "Hands off Greenland." In Nuuk, about a quarter of the city came out, the largest protest in Greenland's history. 4 days later, at Davos, Trump stepped back. He and NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte announced what they called the framework of a future deal on Greenland and the Arctic. The tariffs never took effect, and Trump said he would not use force. The text of that framework has never been published, and the disagreement underneath it still hasn't been bridged. Rasmussen had come out of White House talks that same month calling the disagreement fundamental. 6 months later, nothing about it has changed. Greenland's own government has answered every version of this the same way. "We do not belong to anyone else," Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen said back in March 2025. "We decide our own future." And none of this is new. The United States has wanted Greenland for more than a century and a half. In 1868, the State Department published the case for buying the island, and no offer ever followed. In 1946, the offer was real, and it was made in secret. The price was $100 million in gold, 4 times what America had paid Denmark for the entire Virgin Islands. Denmark refused. The 2026 version is public, and this time, under Greenland's own law, the people who live there decide. Around the year 985, a Norwegian named Eric the Red sailed west from Iceland. An Icelandic court had outlawed him for 3 years over a string of killings, and he spent the exile exploring the fjords of a big island to the west. When he came back, he had a name for it. He called it Greenland, the saga of Eric the Red says, because men will desire much the more to go there if the land has a good name. The name worked. 25 ships sailed for Greenland and 14 made it. The settlers built 2 colonies on the southwest coast, and the bigger one grew to about 500 farms. By 1126, Norse Greenland had its own bishop, and his seat eventually got a stone cathedral. The colony lived on walrus ivory. Greenland tusks supplied much of the ivory carved in medieval Europe, and ships carried them east for centuries. Some of it became luxury goods. Crucifixes, jewelry, and carved chess sets that still turn up in museums today. One 14th century shipment was worth more than 6 years of wool tax from nearly 4,000 Icelandic farms. Some scholars now think the Norse were ivory hunters first, and farmers only to support the hunt. Either way, the colony stayed small. At its peak, maybe 2,500 people. The farm sat on the edge of an island that's mostly ice. An ice sheet covers 4/5 of Greenland. At its deepest, it's about 2 miles thick. Every settlement then and now sits on the ice-free fringe along the coast. To this day, no 2 towns on the island are connected by a road. And the Norse weren't alone out there. People first crossed into Greenland from North America about 4,500 years ago. They came in waves. The Sakat came first, then the Dorset, and each of those early peoples eventually died out or moved on. Around the year 1200, a new people arrived, the Thule, the direct ancestors of today's Greenlanders. They spread along the coast while the Norse were still farming in the south. The two peoples overlapped for about 2 centuries. The Thule hunted seals and whales from kayaks and dog sleds, tools made for the ice. The Norse kept cattle and sheep on land that was turning colder. Then the Norse record started to thin. The western settlement was empty by the late 1300s. The last bishop died in 1378 and no replacement ever came. In September 1408, visiting Icelanders recorded a wedding at a stone church at a place called Valsey. The ship that carried that news home left in 1410. It's the last news anyone has of Norse Greenland. Nobody knows what ended them. Historians argue for a cooling climate as the Little Ice Age closed in on the settlements. They argue for the ivory trade collapsing as cheaper elephant ivory from Africa reached Europe. And they argue for the plague years that gutted the shipping out of Norway, the colony's lifeline home. The last Norse Greenlanders may have sailed away, or they may have died where they were. Denmark eventually came looking. In 1721, a Norwegian Lutheran pastor named Hans Ege Day got permission from King Frederick IV to sail for Greenland. Bergen merchants put up the money and the ship was called the Hope. The plan was to find the lost colony. For all anyone in Copenhagen knew, the colonists were still out there, cut off for 3 centuries. Egede landed on the west coast on July 3rd. He searched the fjords and found stone walls and church ruins, but no Norsemen. The people living among the ruins were Inuit. Egede stayed anyway and built a mission, and in 1728 his colony moved to a harbor he named Godhavn, Good Hope. That town is now Nuuk, Greenland's capital. Denmark counts its colonial era from Egede's landing. The colony that grew from the mission stayed closed to outsiders. Greenland's trade ran through the Royal Greenland Trading Department from 1774, and 2 years later the company held a full monopoly. Foreign ships were barred, and the arrangement held into the middle of the 20th century. For the next century and a half, no other government tried to claim the island. The first one to study buying it was the United States. In March 1867, Secretary of State William H. Seward bought Alaska from Russia. The price was $7.2 million. The newspapers mocked the deal as Seward's folly, and the name stuck. Seward pressed on anyway. He was already negotiating the next purchase with Denmark for its islands in the West Indies. Seward had dreamed big for a long time. As a senator back in 1853, he'd predicted that America's borders would one day reach toward the polar circle. That same year, 1867, he said the annexation of Greenland and Iceland was worthy of serious consideration. The idea came from one of his political allies, a man named Robert J. Walker. Walker had run the Treasury under President Polk about 20 years earlier, and he'd spent his career arguing that America should be bigger. He was involved in the West Indies talks himself. Walker wanted them extended north, to Greenland and Iceland. So Seward commissioned a State Department study. The author was Benjamin Mills Pierce, a young Harvard-trained mining engineer. His father ran the U.S. Coast Survey and put his own name behind the work. The government printing office printed it in 1868 under the title A Report on the Resources of Iceland and Greenland, and copies went out to members of Congress. The report is a sales pitch. It catalogs the fisheries, the game, and the minerals, and it credits Greenland with unusual healthfulness. Walker wrote the introduction himself, and he said the material would be ready for use whenever the question might be considered hereafter by the government. His own position was plain. We should purchase Iceland and Greenland, but especially the latter. Pierce wrote the whole thing from libraries. He never traveled to either island, and he never spoke to a Greenlander, an Icelander, or a Dane. The report doesn't ask what Denmark thought about selling. Denmark hadn't offered. Walker saw Greenland as the likelier buy, partly because it was emptier. Iceland had about 70,000 people, and Greenland maybe 10,000. And Greenland had something Iceland didn't, a mineral called cryolite. Cryolite is a white mineral, and at the time it came out of exactly one place on Earth, Evitut, on Greenland's southwest coast. Miners had been digging it there since 1854. Back then it went into making soda, and the ore already crossed the Atlantic to an American buyer, the Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company in Philadelphia. Later it would become the ingredient that made cheap aluminum possible. Walker also made a geopolitical case. Alaska sat on one side and Greenland would sit on the other. The United States would surround Canada. He wrote that Canada would then choose, peacefully and cheerfully, to become a part of the American Union. Buying the island would also keep it away from Britain, and the report guessed that Greenland was even bigger than it is. Nobody had mapped its north, and the report had it stretching out over the top of Canada. Then the Danish West Indies deal fell apart. Denmark had agreed in 1867 to sell St. Thomas and St. John for $7.5 million, more than Seward had just paid for all of Alaska. The islanders approved the sale in a referendum. The U.S. Senate wouldn't ratify it. A hurricane and an earthquake had hit the islands within weeks of each other, and senators wanted Seward's land buying reined in. By 1868, President Andrew Johnson was heading into impeachment, and Congress was in no mood to hand him or Seward a win. The Greenland idea got laughed at openly. Representative C.C. Washburn of Wisconsin got a copy of the report before it was even distributed, and he drew laughter on the House floor. But are we to stop with the purchase of Alaska and St. Thomas? No, sir. I believe a treaty is now being negotiated with Denmark for the purchase of Greenland and Iceland. Representative Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts mocked anyone insane enough to buy the earthquakes in St. Thomas and ice fields in Greenland. And the Intelligencer in Wheeling, West Virginia, put it on the front page: more icebergs. Seward conceded it himself. The desire to acquire foreign territory has sensibly abated, and Americans now value dollars more and dominion less. No offer for Greenland ever reached Denmark, and the Pierce report stayed in the record. The next American deal with Denmark came half a century later, for the same Caribbean islands the Senate had turned down, plus a third. And that deal came with an American declaration about who owns Greenland. On August 4, 1916, two men met at the Biltmore Hotel in New York and signed the deal that the Senate had turned down back in 1867. Secretary of State Robert Lansing signed for the United States, and Minister Constantine Brun signed for Denmark. The islands were the same ones in the Danish West Indies. The price was $25 million in gold, more than 3 times the 1867 figure. It wasn't even America's first try since that first rejection. It had signed a treaty to buy the islands in 1902, but the Danish parliament killed that one by a single vote. And in 1910, the American minister to Denmark, Maurice Francis Egan, floated an even stranger idea. He proposed trading Denmark, the Philippine island of Mindanao, for Greenland and the West Indies together. Nothing came of any of it. The war made the difference. Germany's submarine campaign was pushing it toward open conflict with the United States. The American fear was specific. If Germany invaded Denmark, the islands would become German. Harbors on the sea lanes to the Panama Canal. Under the Monroe Doctrine, the Americans would not allow that. American archives show that Lansing hinted at more. If no deal was reached, the U.S. military might occupy the islands to keep them from Germany. Denmark had its own reason to hurry. It wanted the sale finished before America entered the war, so the transfer wouldn't break Danish neutrality. The talks ran in secret for close to a year, and Denmark asked for something back. In November 1915, Brun proposed that the United States accept Danish rule over all of Greenland as part of the package. Denmark's real presence covered only the west coast, and the United States held a paper claim of its own to northern Greenland from the journeys of Charles Francis Hall and Robert Peary. Lansing weighed it and folded it into the deal. In his memoirs, he was blunt about why refusing to recognize Danish Greenland would have been folly. The whole negotiation might have been wrecked. So on the same day the treaty was signed, Lansing signed a second, shorter paper, a declaration. It says the United States will not object to the Danish government extending their political and economic interests to the whole of Greenland. The substance is 1 sentence long. It was attached to the treaty and approved with it, and it's been treated as binding ever since. The Senate said yes in September. On December 14, 1916, Denmark held the first national referendum in its history. The question was whether to sell the islands, and the voters said yes. The final papers were exchanged in Washington on January 17, 1917. On March 31, 1917, Lansing handed Brun the payment, the full price, in gold. The Danish flag came down at 4 that afternoon, and the American flag went up on St. Thomas and St. Croix. 6 days later, the United States declared war on Germany. Denmark went to work with that declaration. It spent the next few years collecting similar promises from other governments, and on May 10, 1921, it issued a decree. The whole of Greenland was now Danish territory. That was 200 years after Hans Egede landed. One country objected. Norway protested the decree, formally over Denmark extending its closed trade monopoly, and behind the formal complaint over the land itself. Norwegian hunters worked eastern Greenland, and in Norway's view, Danish rule covered only the settled areas. In June 1931, a Norwegian trapper named Halvard Devold raised the Norwegian flag at Migbukta on Greenland's east coast. The following month, on July 10th, Norway's government declared it had occupied the unsettled stretch, and it named the place Erik the Red's Land. The dispute went to the Permanent Court of International Justice in The Hague. On April 5, 1933, the court ruled 12 votes to 2 for Denmark. It found that Denmark had held authority over the whole island without a break. And it found that Norway's own foreign minister, Niels Eland, had assured Denmark back in 1919 that Norway would not make any difficulties. Norway dropped the claim. So Denmark's title to the whole island held. It rested partly on the promises Denmark had collected, including America's 1916 promise not to object. 24 years after the flags changed, American soldiers would arrive in Greenland in force. Henrik Kaufmann, Denmark's own ambassador in Washington, let them in, and his government charged him with treason for it. On the morning of April 9, 1940, Germany occupied Denmark. The whole thing took hours. In Washington, Denmark's minister was a diplomat named Henrik Kaufmann, in the post since August 1939. By the next day, he'd made his position public. He couldn't take orders from a government under German occupation. The United States kept dealing with him as Denmark's minister anyway. The day after the occupation, President Roosevelt signed an order putting Danish assets in the United States under Treasury control. Greenland, meanwhile, was cut off from Copenhagen entirely. The island's 2 Danish governors, Eske Brun and Axel Svane, used an emergency clause in the 1925 law that governed Greenland and started running the island themselves. In May, they asked Washington to note the exposed position of the Danish flag in Greenland. In June, they nationalized the cryolite mine at Evig, whose exports kept the cut-off island solvent through the war. For a while, nobody agreed on who spoke for the island. The governors disputed Kaufmann's right to negotiate for Greenland, and at first the State Department leaned toward the governors. Svane went to New York to run Greenland's supply lines, Brun stayed and ran the island, and in the end, the State Department backed Kaufmann. The Americans wanted an agreement of their own. They treated Greenland as part of their own hemisphere's defense, the same Monroe Doctrine logic behind the Virgin Islands purchase. The war was pushing them to make that real, and they needed a Dane with the standing to sign. Kaufmann negotiated a defense agreement with Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He signed it in Washington on April 9, 1941, 1 year to the day after the occupation of Denmark. Kaufmann signed on behalf of His Majesty the King of Denmark in his capacity as sovereign of Greenland. The king hadn't been asked first, and Kaufmann told Copenhagen 2 days after the fact. The agreement gave the United States the right to build and run defense works across Greenland, airfields, seaplane bases, radio, and weather stations. The same document said the island stayed Danish. Article 10 set the exit terms. The agreement stays in force until it is agreed that the present dangers to the peace and security of the American continent have passed. The United States couldn't be made to leave on Denmark's say-so alone. A week after the signing, the Danish government declared the agreement void and recalled Kaufmann. It dismissed him from the Foreign Service, stripped his rank, charged him with high treason, and ordered his property seized. Kaufmann ignored all of it. Diplomats at other Danish missions who sided with him were dismissed too. With the agreement signed, the State Department confirmed Kaufmann's control of Danish state money in America, with access to Danish gold on deposit. He used it to run his own legation and a network of breakaway Danish missions, a foreign service answering to no government at all. President Roosevelt took a personal interest in Greenland's fate, and with Copenhagen occupied, Kaufmann ran much of Denmark's business in the Americas on his own. Denmark was freed on May 5, 1945. 11 days later, both chambers of the Danish parliament approved the Greenland Agreement. Not one member voted against it. The king gave his approval the week after in a council of state. The treason case was dropped. Kaufmann came out of the war promoted. He joined Denmark's Liberation Cabinet as a minister, signed the United Nations Charter for Denmark that June, and went back to Washington as ambassador. He held the post until 1958. The agreement outlived the fight over it. It got Kaufmann charged with treason, and now it carried Denmark's full approval. Article 10 still had no exit date. American crews had started arriving within months of the signing. The first fight they'd face on the island was over weather stations. In September 1941, 3 months before America was even in the war, the Coast Guard stopped a Norwegian trawler called the Busko off Greenland's coast and brought it to Boston. The ship looked like an ordinary resupply boat. But one man aboard was a Norwegian civilian, and his job was to send weather reports back to German contacts in Norway. The fight over Greenland was a fight over the North Atlantic's weather. Weather decided when convoys sailed and when planes flew, and the weather over that ocean forms upwind, to the northwest, out over the Arctic. Whoever had stations up there could see the storms coming before anyone else. So the Americans started building. After the 1941 agreement, U.S. crews put up airfields along the coast under a code name, Bluey. The main one, Bluey West 1, went up at Narsarsuaq in the south. A second rose on the east coast, and a naval base went in near the cryolite mine. Bluey West 1 became the key refueling stop on the North Atlantic ferry route. Thousands of aircraft heading to Britain crossed by way of Greenland, landing there to fuel up before the last legs across. The base also became headquarters for the 2 American commands on the island, the Coast Guard's Greenland Patrol and the Army's Air Command. And the cryolite mine still mattered. Its ore was the flux used to smelt aircraft aluminum, so Greenland cryolite went into the planes crossing overhead. Guarding it started before America was even in the war. In 1940, 15 Coast Guardsmen were quietly discharged so they could work the mine as civilian guards with naval guns to defend it. Later, about 500 American soldiers guarded the mine and the 100-odd miners who worked it. Greenland's northeast coast is enormous and empty. To watch it, the Coast Guard and Governor Eske Brun set up the Northeast Greenland Sledge Patrol. 15 men, most of them hunters who knew the coast, ran the shore by dog sled looking for any sign the Germans had landed. In August 1942, the Germans landed. They put 4 secret weather teams on the east coast over the next 2 years. The first was called Holzauge, set up at Hansa Bay on Sabine Island under a lieutenant named Hermann Ritter. A sledge patrol team founded on March 11, 1943. The Germans spotted them and gave chase. The patrolmen had to abandon their gear and their dog teams and fall back to their own station at Eskimonis to warn their commander, a Dane named Ib Poulsen. Poulsen radioed the Greenland government on March 13th and asked for automatic weapons. 2 days later, Brun gave the patrol a new name. He officially designated it the Army of Greenland, with Poulsen as its captain. It was an army of 15 men, declared by a governor with no line back to his own occupied country. On March 23rd, the Germans attacked Eskimonis, took it, and burned it 2 days later. The patrolmen based there weren't hit, but they had to cross 400 miles of ice on foot to reach the next station, at Ella Island, with no sleds and no food. 3 days after the attack at a place called Sandodden, the Germans ambushed Corporal Eli Knudsen and killed him. He was the only man the sledge patrol lost in the entire war. In late April, a patrolman named Marius Jensen captured Lieutenant Ritter, the German commander himself, and hauled him by sledge on the long trip south to the Americans at Scoresby Sound. The rest of the stations were cleared over the next year and a half. American bombers flew from Iceland to hit the Sabine base, and the Coast Guard seized the last 2 German teams as they tried to land in October 1944. One cutter, the Eastwind, even took a German supply ship, the Externstein, and put it into American service under a new name. On May 5, 1945, Greenland celebrated Denmark's liberation, and Brun handed his emergency powers back to Copenhagen. By then, the Americans had built 17 installations across the island, airfields, ports, weather, and radio stations, and they didn't leave. The presence carried on past the end of the war. Within a year, the United States would stop asking to use the island. It would try to buy it. In April 1946, a State Department official named John Hickerson sat in on a Pentagon planning meeting and wrote down what he heard. The committee, he reported, agreed on 3 things: that money is plentiful now, that Greenland is completely worthless to Denmark, and that the control of Greenland is indispensable to the safety of the United States. The meeting was a planning committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Hickerson said practically every member agreed the United States should try to buy Greenland outright. He added one caution of his own. He doubted the Danes would want to sell. The interest came from geography. The Cold War was beginning, and American planners were already thinking about the next war, one fought by long-range bombers carrying atomic weapons. The shortest path for such a bomber, flying between the United States and the Soviet Union, runs over the North Pole. Greenland sits directly under that path, a stepping stone in the middle of it. To American planners, that made the island essential. There was also a clock running. The whole idea began as a counter-move. Denmark wanted to end the wartime agreement of 1941 and take its island back. But by the end of the war, the United States had built 17 bases in Greenland, and it had no intention of leaving. So the State Department put a price on it. In May, a diplomat named William Trimble wrote the number down, $100 million in gold. Buying Greenland, he argued, would give the United States valuable bases from which to launch an air counteroffensive over the Arctic area in the event of attack. There was a second idea on the table, too. American officials discussed a swap. Oil-rich land in Alaska, traded to Denmark for parts of Greenland. Trimble figured the Danes would like that even less than the cash. The offer went to a real meeting in December 1946. On the 14th in New York, Secretary of State James Burns put it to Denmark's Foreign Minister Gustav Rasmussen. He laid out three options. The United States could keep its base rights, or take over Greenland's defense entirely, or buy the island. Burns made clear the third was the one he wanted. By the American account, Rasmussen hadn't expected the third option at all. His real answer came about a month later to the American ambassador. "While we owe much to America," Rasmussen said, "I do not feel that we owe them the whole island of Greenland." Denmark didn't want to sell. There was no counteroffer and no haggling over the price, just a refusal. But the United States wasn't leaving either. In 1947, Denmark formally asked to end the 1941 agreement, and the Americans stalled. By then, the Pentagon was calling Greenland a primary base against the Soviet Union. A National Security Council report ranked its bases there, with Iceland and the Azores, as of extreme importance for any war in the next 15 or 20 years. The deadlock broke in 1949. Denmark signed the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4th and gave up its long tradition of neutrality. That changed the whole question. The United States no longer needed to own Greenland. It only needed to operate there, alongside an ally, under a shared defense. The two countries settled it in April 1951. A new agreement, the Defense of Greenland Agreement, replaced the 1941 treaty. It confirmed that Greenland was Danish, and it gave the United States defined areas to use under NATO's plans. That agreement still governs the American presence on the island today. The purchase offer, meanwhile, stayed buried. The documents were declassified around 1971, but nobody noticed them until a Danish newspaper published them in 1991. By the time the story came out, 45 years had passed, and most of the men who made the offer and refused it were gone. So America never bought Greenland. It got the permanent base access it wanted through NATO, without owning the island or paying for it. The first thing the 1951 agreement built was a base at the very top of Greenland. Building it meant moving the people who already lived there. In 1951, before the new treaty was even final, the Americans started building. A convoy of 120 ships and an airlift of some 3,000 flights headed for the far north of Greenland, under a code name, Operation Blue Jay. 12,000 construction workers came with it. Most of the base went up in about 60 days of round-the-clock work, with the men living aboard the ships. They were building Thule Air Base. It went up on a flat plain by North Star Bay at the very top of the island, with a runway long enough for the Air Force's biggest bombers. No American base has ever sat farther north. The scale was enormous. By 1952, the base covered 320 square kilometers. It had quarters for as many as 10,000 men. The Americans kept it secret until that September, and people compared the whole effort to the building of the Panama Canal. Thule existed for the same reason the 1946 planners wanted the island: bombers based there could stage towards Soviet targets over the top of the world, closer to the enemy than from anywhere else. The plane already had people on it. The Inuit had lived on that coast for centuries, the northernmost people on Earth, hunters of seal and walrus and bear. Their main settlement was Umanak on North Star Bay, a community of just over 200 people. In April 1953, the Americans wanted to add an anti-aircraft battery near Umanak, and they asked the Danes to move the people. Denmark agreed. On May 25, 1953, Danish officials came to Umanak and told the families to leave. There were 116 of them, and they had to go immediately. Within days, while the sea ice could still hold a dog sled, all of them moved north to Qaanaaq, about 150 kilometers up the coast. They lived in tents there until wooden houses could be built that autumn. Their old houses at Umanak were later burned. 11 days after the move, on June 5, 1953, Denmark adopted a new constitution. It ended Greenland's status as a colony and made every Greenlander a full Danish citizen. The people just evicted from North Star Bay became citizens the same month. The Inuit spent the next half-century in court over it. In 1999, the Eastern High Court in Denmark ruled that the eviction had to be treated as an expropriation, a taking. It awarded the tribe 500,000 kroner and smaller sums to the individuals who were moved. That September, the Danish Prime Minister Poul Nyrup Rasmussen issued a written apology. He gave it in Greenlandic. The word was Utokatserpuget, and it was the first time a Danish prime minister had apologized in the language. The apology didn't come with a way home. In 2003, Denmark's Supreme Court upheld the finding that the move was a taking, but it gave the Inuit no right to return. The European Court of Human Rights declined to hear the case in 2006. Up on the hill above the base, the Americans built a radar. It was part of the ballistic missile early warning system, and it went live on September 30th, 1960. 5 days later, it reported a massive Soviet missile launch. It was the moon coming up over the horizon. The radar at Thule was built to catch a Soviet first strike, and it's still running today, but the base wasn't the only thing the Army built in Greenland. Around the same time, well over 100 miles inland, they were digging a city into the ice. In June 1959, the Army Corps of Engineers started cutting into the ice sheet itself, well over 100 miles inland from Thule. Trenching machines carved long channels down into the ice and roofed them over with steel arches. The longest one, which the men called Main Street, ran more than 1,000 feet. The site was chosen for how far in it sat. It got its name Camp Century because it was meant to be 100 miles from the edge of the ice cap. The cold there ran to 70 below, and the wind could hit 125 miles an hour, hurricane force twice over, more than 4 feet of snow fell every year. The pieces still had to get there. The engineers first cut a 3-mile road, then hauled 6,000 tons of supplies in over the ice. The heavy equipment came on giant sleds that topped out at 2 miles an hour, which made the trip from Thule a 70-hour crawl. Inside the trenches, they built a town. 21 tunnels held prefabricated wooden buildings, set on air gaps so their heat wouldn't melt the ice around them. There were dormitories, a kitchen, a hospital, a laundry, a chapel, and a barber shop. A well drilled into the ice gave 10,000 gallons of fresh water a day. Around 200 men could live down there. And the whole thing ran on nuclear power. The last piece to arrive was a portable reactor called the PM-2A. It was the first of its kind, and it weighed 400 tons on its own. In that cold, metal turned brittle and cracked easily, so everything had to be handled with care. As one officer, Major Jim Barnett, put it, they took every precaution in the book and some that weren't in it. The reactor started up in 1960 and ran for 33 months. They called it Camp Century, the city under the ice, and the Army wasn't hiding it. It ran the place openly as a polar research station, and it made a film about it, the story of Camp Century, the city under ice, in 1963. The camp even turned up in the Army's own television series. You can still watch the footage today. Officially then, Camp Century was science, and real science did happen there. some of it landmark. In July 1966, drillers at the camp pulled up the first ice core ever taken all the way down to bedrock. It reached nearly 1,400 meters into the ice. A Danish scientist named Willy Dansgaard studied that core. In 1969, he published his analysis. He'd read about 100,000 years of the Earth's climate out of the ice, layer by layer. It was the start of ice core science, the field that now tracks global warming. But the ice wouldn't hold still. The trenches were closing under the weight of the sheet above them. By 1962, ceilings had dropped 5 feet, and the room holding the reactor had to be shaved back to keep it from being crushed. The end came quickly. The reactor was shut down in 1963 and pulled out the next year. The camp went to summer-only use, and by 1967 it was abandoned. The ice closed over the tunnels and crushed them. It left waste behind, though. The reactor alone had produced more than 40,000 gallons of radioactive coolant, and when the camp was abandoned, that was left in the ice, along with diesel fuel and chemical waste. A 2016 study warned that a warming ice sheet could reach it before the century is out. William Colgan, who led that study, put it this way: back in the 1960s, the term global warming hadn't even been coined. Nobody thought the waste would ever surface. The men who dug Camp Century were told they were building a research station. The tunnels were cut wider than that. There was a military reason for the extra room, and Denmark, which owned the ice, was never told what it was. In 1960, the Army's Engineer Studies Center produced a report titled Strategic Value of the Greenland Ice Cap. One line in it explained the wide tunnels at Camp Century. The missile force, it read, is hidden and elusive. The plan was called Project Iceworm, and the idea was to hide as many as 600 nuclear missiles under the Greenland ice. The missile even had a name, the Iceman, a shortened version of the Air Force's newest weapon, the Minuteman. It was built to fly about 3,300 miles, far enough to reach most of the Soviet Union. Hiding 600 of them would have taken a network of tunnels covering 52,000 square miles, about 3 times the size of Denmark. The missiles would ride on rails between launch points 4 miles apart. 60 control centers would run them, and new tunnels would be cut every year so no one could ever know which tunnel held a missile. Running it would have meant 11,000 soldiers living full-time under the ice. The point of all that was survival. The Soviets couldn't destroy missiles they couldn't find, and the launch sites would never stay in one place. The ice killed it first. Camp Century had already shown what the ice sheet does. It closes tunnels within a couple of years. The Army couldn't risk hundreds of missiles in tunnels that might collapse. There were smaller problems, too. The Minuteman would have to be rebuilt to work in extreme cold, and it would be hard to locate the missiles or stay in contact with them under a moving ice sheet. The Pentagon finished it off. The Navy was pushing a rival plan, sharing nuclear weapons across NATO with its own Polaris missiles. The Army partly wanted Iceworm to avoid losing that funding fight. When the Navy's plan won out, the Army no longer needed Iceworm, and the project was canceled in 1963. Through all of it, Denmark was kept in the dark. It had agreed to Camp Century as a research station. It was never told about the missiles. The plan only became public in January 1997, in a Danish parliamentary inquiry. The report, called Greenland During the Cold War, was built on declassified American documents. It was how Denmark learned what the tunnels had been for, and Iceworm wasn't the only secret. In November 1957, the U.S. Ambassador Val Petersen went to the Danish Prime Minister H.C. Hansen with a question. He asked whether Denmark wished to be informed about any American nuclear weapons in Greenland. Hansen answered in a private note dated November 16, 1957. "I do not think," he wrote, "that your remarks give rise to any comments from my side." He asked for no information, raised no objection, and wanted the exchange kept quiet. The United States read that silence as a green light. In 1958, it stored 4 nuclear bombs at Thule, and it kept dozens of nuclear warheads there into 1965. All of it happened while Denmark's public policy banned nuclear weapons from Danish soil. That stayed secret until 1968, when a bomber caught fire in the sky over Greenland. On January 21, 1968, a B-52 bomber was flying a slow circle over Thule. It was part of an operation called Chrome Dome. Bombers kept in the air around the clock, armed, so that a Soviet first strike couldn't catch them all on the ground. This one had a specific job. It was watching over the radar at Thule, the one built to catch a Soviet attack. Then a fire started. A crewman had stuffed some foam cushions in front of a heating vent, and about 6 hours into the flight, they caught. The extinguishers ran empty, the cabin filled with smoke, and the plane lost power. The crew had to bail out. 6 of the 7 men ejected and survived. The 7th, the co-pilot, was named Leonard Svitenko, and he'd given up his ejection seat earlier in the flight. He was killed trying to climb out through a lower hatch. The empty bomber came down on the sea ice of North Star Bay, about 7 miles from Thule. It was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs, each one many times more powerful than the bomb that leveled Hiroshima. On impact, the conventional explosives inside the bombs went off. There was no nuclear blast because that takes a precise trigger and a crash doesn't supply one. But the explosion tore the weapons apart and scattered plutonium across a mile of blackened ice. The cleanup was named Project Crested Ice, though the men who did it called it Dr. Frieselov. About 700 Americans and Danes worked the crash site through the winter, in the polar dark, in temperatures that fell to 60 below, and they worked against a deadline. When the spring melt came, the sea ice would break up and drop everything on it to the bottom of the bay. The site sat in constant winter darkness, lit only by lanterns. The crews mapped the contamination with a new radiation detector, rushed up from the Lawrence Livermore Weapons Lab in California. One of the planes that flew in landed carrying 1,500 pounds of raw horse meat, food for the sled dogs pulling gear across the ice. They carried out an enormous amount. 268 tanks of contaminated ice and snow were shipped to South Carolina, and the wreckage of the weapons went to Texas. The operation finished in September 1968, but they never found everything. All 4 bombs had been destroyed in the crash. The searchers couldn't recover one piece of one bomb, a uranium part from its core, somewhere on the floor of the bay. A story grew out of that missing piece. In 2008, the BBC reported that an entire bomb had been lost off Thule and never found. The Danish government commissioned a study to settle it. The study's title gave away its finding: there is no bomb, there was no bomb, they were not looking for a bomb. The crash changed how America flew. Within days, the United States ended the armed airborne patrols, and bombers stopped carrying live nuclear weapons on alert over the Arctic. It also exposed a secret. To clean up the crash, the United States had to admit that its bombers had been flying nuclear weapons over Greenland all along. That ran straight against Denmark's public policy, which held that Danish soil was nuclear-free. The men who cleaned it up paid a price. Many of the Danish workers later developed cancer at unusually high rates. They sued the United States in 1987 and lost. In 1995, Denmark paid compensation of its own to the 1,700 workers, 50,000 kroner each, around $7,000. That same year, the rest of the story came out. In 1995, the H.C. Hansen letter surfaced, along with the record of the nuclear weapons once stored at Thule. Denmark ordered the inquiry that finally told it what had been sitting on its ice and under it. But by then, the biggest change in Greenland had nothing to do with America. Greenland had already begun taking over its own government. On January 17, 1979, Greenlanders went to the polls and voted for home rule, and about 70% said yes. That May, for the first time, Greenland got a parliament and a government of its own in Nuuk. Home rule handed real powers to that government. It took over taxation, the fisheries, the schools, and industry, and later its own health care. Denmark kept the core powers of a state: foreign affairs, defense, the courts, and the currency. Greenland had been a colony until 1953. That year, Denmark's new constitution turned it into a county and made every Greenlander a Danish citizen. And in 1954, the United Nations signed off on the change. Becoming a county didn't mean being left alone. Denmark set out to modernize Greenland, and fast. Two big state programs, one launched in the 1950s and one in the 1960s, remade the island on a Danish model. Danish housing, Danish schooling, and a Danish-trained workforce. Part of the plan was to move people. Greenlanders were pulled out of small, scattered settlements, which the planners called unprofitable and unhealthy, and concentrated into a handful of coastal towns. In Nuuk, many of them ended up in a single concrete apartment block, called Block P. When it went up in the mid-1960s, roughly 1 in 100 people on the whole island lived inside that one building. And the system paid people differently. A rule tied wages to where you were born, so a Dane doing a job in Greenland earned more than a Greenlander doing the same job. By the 1970s, 1 in 5 people on the island was Danish, most of them running the construction and the offices. Greenland's first political party had formed in 1963, and the push for home rule grew straight out of all this. Greenland also left Europe. It had been pulled into the European community in 1973, when Denmark joined, even though Greenlanders had voted heavily against joining. In 1982, they voted to leave, and in 1985, they walked out. The reason was fish. Greenland wanted control of its own fishing grounds, and staying in the community meant sharing them. It became the only territory ever to vote its way out of the European project, until Britain did it decades later. The break wasn't total, though. Greenland stayed linked to Europe as an overseas territory, and it let European boats keep fishing its waters in return for money and duty-free sales of its catch. The next vote went further. On November 25, 2008, Greenlanders voted again, this time for self-rule, and 75% were in favor. The Self-Government Act took effect on June 21, 2009, Greenland's National Day. It recognized Greenlanders as a people with the right of self-determination under international law. It made Greenlandic the official language, and it handed Greenland its own subsoil, the rights to whatever lay under the ground. The law also wrote down, in plain language, how Greenland could become an independent country. Section 21 opens with a single sentence. Decision regarding Greenland's independence shall be taken by the people of Greenland. From there, it lays out the steps. Greenland decides it wants independence. It negotiates the terms with Denmark. Its own parliament approves the deal, the people approve it in a referendum, and the Danish parliament gives its consent. One line in the law is plainer than the rest. Independence for Greenland, it reads, shall imply that Greenland assumes sovereignty over the Greenland territory. There is a catch, and it's money. Denmark still sends Greenland a block grant every year. It was about 3.5 billion kroner when the law passed, and it's around 4.3 billion now. For a population of about 57,000 people, that grant is just under a fifth of the whole economy, and more than half of what the government spends. The grant comes with a clause. If Greenland starts earning real money from mining, the grant shrinks by half of whatever it earns above a set line. Since 2009, Greenland has had a written legal path to full independence. And just as that path was set down, the minerals that could pay for it were drawing serious interest from outside. Above the town of Narsak, in southern Greenland, there's a mountain called Kva-ne-fjell. By its developer's account, it holds one of the largest deposits of rare earth metals on Earth. That developer has a Chinese company among its shareholders, and the same rock that holds the rare earths also holds uranium. Rare earths are the metals that make modern machines work. They go into the magnets and phones and wind turbines, into electric cars, and into guided weapons. China refines most of the world's supply, so a deposit like Kva-ne-fjell draws a lot of attention. In April 2021, Greenland held a snap election, and the mine was the central issue. The party that opposed it, Inuit Ataqatigiit, won, and it moved quickly. Months later, Greenland's parliament banned uranium mining above a low limit. Kva-ne-fjell's ore runs far above that limit, so the mine was killed by law. The developer sued. Its claim runs to about $11.5 billion, more than 10 times Greenland's entire yearly budget. In October 2025, a tribunal ruled that the core of the case belongs in Greenland's own courts, and the fight's still going. The ground holds far more than the mines produce. Greenland has deposits of 43 of the 50 minerals the United States lists as critical, but it's only got 2 working mines, and neither one produces rare earths. One mine digs anorthosite, a rock used for aluminum and glass, and the other digs gold. A ruby mine closed in 2023, and no rare earths have ever been sold out of Greenland. Outside interest in Greenland had been building for years before the current standoff, and it came from more than one direction. In 2016, a Chinese company tried to buy an abandoned Danish naval base in Greenland. Denmark pulled it off the market and kept it for its own military. The next contest was over airports. In 2018, a Chinese state company was shortlisted to build new airports in Greenland, and the U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis pressed Copenhagen to keep it out. Denmark stepped in, bought a third of the airport project itself, and the Chinese bid was withdrawn in 2019. The United States was after the same access, and it made its own moves. It opened a way to fund projects in Greenland and reopened a consulate in Nuuk in 2020. 5 years later, a U.S. government bank offered a letter of interest up to $120 million toward a different rare earth project called Tan Breeze. In 2023, it also renamed the base. Thule Air Base became P2 Fix Space Base, the American base taking the Greenlandic name for the place it sits on. The minerals create a bind. The ones Greenland's own law says could pay for its independence are the same ones the United States, China, and Denmark are all after. For a century, Greenland mattered for where it sat, on the shortest line between the powers. Now it matters for what it holds too, and for who gets to dig it up. For years, most of this competition stayed quiet in boardrooms and government offices. Then in 2019, the oldest idea of all came back into the open. A U.S. president offered in public to buy the whole island. On August 15, 2019, the Wall Street Journal reported that President Donald Trump had been asking his aides about buying Greenland. Most people took it for a passing notion. Greenland answered within a day when its foreign ministry put out a short line: "Greenland is open for business, but not for sale." Then Trump confirmed it himself. On August 18th, boarding Air Force One in New Jersey, he told reporters it was real. Essentially, he said, it's a large real estate deal. He added that it wasn't his top priority. In his words, not number one on the burner. Trump said Denmark was losing about $700 million a year on Greenland, and that the United States could take it off their hands. His economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, confirmed the White House was looking at it. Denmark's answer came from the Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, who was visiting Greenland at the time. "Greenland is not for sale," she said. "Greenland is not Danish. Greenland belongs to Greenland." She had one more word for the idea, and she called it an absurd discussion. Trump answered that with a joke of his own. On August 19th, he posted a photoshopped image of a gold skyscraper dropped onto a small Greenlandic town with the caption, "I promise not to do this to Greenland." On August 20th, Trump called off a state visit to Copenhagen, one that had been planned for early September. He announced the cancellation in a post, saying Frederiksen had no interest in discussing the purchase. The next day, he came back to that word. He said that calling the idea absurd had been nasty, and he added, "She's not talking to me. She's talking to the United States of America." None of this was new. It was the same offer James Burns had made in secret in 1946, only now it was public. But one thing had changed. In 1946, the United States had asked Denmark. This time, Greenland answered first, because its future had been its own to decide since 2009. For most people watching, it read as a strange late summer news story, and by September, it had faded. The 2019 offer was treated as a joke that got out of hand. 5 years later, the same idea came back, this time as policy, with tariffs and envoys behind it. On January 7, 2025, at Mar-a-Lago, a reporter asked President-elect Donald Trump whether he would rule out using military or economic force to take Greenland. He said he would not rule it out. The same day, his son Donald Trump Jr. flew to Nuuk. Trump said the same thing to Congress. In an address on March 4th, he said of Greenland, "One way or the other, we're going to get it." Then Greenland voted. On March 11th, its election produced a surprise winner, Democratic, a party that favored a slow, careful path toward independence. The new government formed quickly, and on March 28th, Jens Frederik Nielsen, 33 years old, took office at the head of a broad four-party government. It came together just before the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance landed at Pituffik. Vance had a message for Denmark: "You have not done a good job by the people of Greenland." Weeks later, the American commander of the base was removed from her post after an internal email tried to distance Pituffik from Vance's remarks. On May 4th on NBC, Trump was asked again about taking the island. "I don't rule it out," he said. "We need Greenland very badly." Denmark increased its own military spending. In January 2025, it announced an Arctic defense plan worth 14.5 billion kroner. In October, it added 27 billion more for patrol ships, radar, and a new Greenlandic Ranger unit. In December, Trump named Louisiana's governor, Jeff Landry, his special envoy to Greenland, and Landry accepted with a post calling it an honor to make Greenland a part of the U.S. Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen called the statement completely unacceptable and summoned the American ambassador. On January 6th, the White House said the president had discussed a range of options on Greenland, including military ones. Fredriksson responded on Danish television. "If the United States chooses to attack another NATO country militarily," she said, "then everything stops." A week later, the two sides sat down. On January 14th, Vance hosted Rasmussen and Greenland's foreign minister, Vivian Motzfeldt, at the White House. They came out of it calling the disagreement fundamental, but they agreed to keep talking. Europe was lining up behind Denmark and Greenland in public. 7 of its leaders, France's and Germany's and Britain's among them, put out a joint statement saying Greenland belongs to its people. On January 15th, Allied soldiers landed in Greenland. France sent about 15 to Nuuk, Germany sent 13, and 5 more countries sent small teams of their own. 2 days later, on January 17th, Trump posted an ultimatum, announcing tariffs on Denmark and 7 other allies. They would stay, he wrote, until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Protests broke out the same day. Thousands marched in Copenhagen under the slogan, "Hands off Greenland," and in Nuuk, about a quarter of the whole city turned out, the largest protest in Greenland's history. 4 days later at Davos, Trump and NATO's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, announced what they called a framework for a future deal. Rutte described it as an Arctic security understanding and said Greenland's minerals hadn't come up, the tariffs never took effect, and Trump said he would not use force. The framework itself has never been made public. The standoff held into the summer. In July 2026, at the NATO summit in Ankara, Trump said again that the United States should control Greenland. The summit's final statement didn't mention the island at all. And the disagreement Rasmussen had described in January had not moved by July. The question of who gets Greenland is louder now than it's been in more than a century and a half, and this time, the island itself has a formal say in the answer. America's tried to take Greenland 3 times. In 1868, the State Department printed the case for buying it and never made an offer. Then it made one, in secret, $100 million in gold. And in 2026, it tried a 3rd time in public with tariffs. Each time, the answer was the same. Denmark said no. America's pursuit of the island left a long paper trail. There was a report in 1868 and a one-line declaration in 1916 promising not to object to Danish rule. There was a signature in 1941 from an ambassador his own government charged with treason, and a secret offer in 1946. Then came a defense clause with no end date in 1951. A city was dug into the ice in 1959. Hydrogen bombs came down on the sea ice in 1968. An apology followed in Greenlandic in 1999. And in 2009, a section of law wrote down how Greenland could leave. For most of that history, every American approach ran into the same wall. Denmark held the legal title to the island, and the choice wasn't anyone else's to make. Since 2009, that's no longer true. Anyone who wants Greenland now has to reckon with about 57,000 people who hold a written legal path to their own independence. The island isn't only Denmark's to give away anymore. That path runs through the ground. Greenland's block grant covers about a fifth of its economy, and it shrinks as mining income grows. The minerals that could fund an independent Greenland are the same ones the outside powers came for. The people themselves live in the middle of all this, the northernmost society on Earth, on the thin, ice-free edge of the largest island in the world. Greenland is not for sale. One day, by a procedure written in its own language, it may simply become its own country. And on the hill above the base the Americans still run, the radar keeps watching the top of the world.